LSAC just added a ton of new LSAT questions into LawHub in advance of the November 2024 LSAT. Today, I'll walk you through how to use or how not to use these questions whenever you're taking the test. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. So recently, LSAC, without any fanfare or any announcement that I saw, they added over 1,000 additional LSAT questions into LawHub. These are real, actual, official LSAT questions previously administered on scored LSATs, great for practice, but most of them are from the oldest LSATs ever, starting with prep test number 1, administered in June 1991, and other exams administered throughout the early 1990s, meaning that these questions are roughly 30 years old. Specifically, these questions are the logical reasoning and reading comp questions from prep tests 1 to 18, 21, 23, prep test A, and the February 1997 LSAT. You can find these questions in the additional practice section in LawHub. Collectively, there are roughly 1,300 questions in this new set. These questions were virtually out of print. They were not in LawHub. Most of them were no longer even available in books on Amazon, although a handful of them were. Strangely, LSAC seems to have somewhat disavowed these questions as if they would rather they did not exist. However, due to the previous LSAT numbering system going from 1 to 94, these questions were always somewhat strangely absent in the old LawHub prior to the point at which LSAC removed the logic game section after the June test. So why do I say LSAC has somewhat disavowed these questions? Well, for a couple of reasons. One of them is the very note that LSAC includes introducing this section under additional practice in LawHub. They write, and I quote, "These supplemental practice materials are solely intended for the purpose of providing additional practice related to the relevant skills related to logical reasoning, reading comprehension, and analysis that are analogous to the skills tested on the LSAT, and your performance on these supplemental items is not indicative or reflective on how may perform on the official LSAT. These supplemental practice materials are not authorized, endorsed, or recommended as official LSAT preparation materials by LSAC." So when I spoke there, that was not a speako or a typo in any way. LSAC could use some proofreading here, but regardless, the point here is somewhat odd, right? Because they're saying that these questions are intended for additional practice. Well, of course, what else would they be for? Of course, you're doing LSAT questions for practice to test your abilities and test your skills prior to taking the actual LSAT. Now, why do they say these are analogous to skills tested on the LSAT rather than these are the same skills tested on the LSAT? And why isn't it indicative or reflective of how you would perform on the official LSAT, given that these were actual official LSAT questions previously administered? So this is why I get the sense in part that LSAC is somewhat ambivalent or torn about the fact that these questions even exist. So we have to go into a little bit of LSAT history to better understand how these questions relate to the modern day LSAT. So LSAC formally took over the development of LSAT questions with the June 1991 test, prep test number 1. Previously, the Educational Testing Service, aka ETS, the people who make the SAT, for example, they were the ones responsible. They were the ones who wrote test content. However, with that shift to the then new LSAT format in June 1991, ETS's role shifted from directly writing the questions to being more of a consultative role where they were advising LSAC as LSAC built up its own team of psychometricians, meaning people who developed LSAT test content and evaluated the validity of those test questions. So LSAC was basically just getting warmed up, just getting started in the early 90s, and they were writing questions in consultation with ETS, but they were still kind of dipping their toes in the water, still kind of figuring things out. So bottom line, LSAC does not want to stand behind the quality of these super old questions in relation to the much better questions written later. So if you look at the questions from prep tests 1 to 20 or so, they're not as tightly written, not as rigorous. LSAC hadn't really yet come into its own, but around prep test 20, LSAC basically got better at writing exam questions. And so LSAC didn't even publish a lot of these exam questions in books of 10, which is why the first book of 10 started with exam number 7, then it included 9 to 16 and 18, but they were leaving out prep tests 1 to 6, prep test 8, and prep test 17. They were always just strangely left out of those initial books of 10. But LSAC, at the same time as they are somewhat perhaps embarrassed by these old questions, they also want to make LawHub the one-stop destination for getting official LSAT questions. They want to beef it up, and it's a whole lot easier to just put out these old questions than to write brand new questions just for test prep materials, because it is actually quite expensive for LSAC to write new valid LSAT questions. And so the question, of course, for you, aside from this history lesson here, is how do we actually recommend using these new additional practice questions for your LSAT studying? So, of course, if you're taking the November LSAT in just a couple days, of course, all the best to you. I would not recommend doing super old, perhaps slightly lower quality LSAT questions at the expense of doing the newest LSAT prep material in your final week before the test. In fact, if you're taking the LSAT in January, I also might not recommend doing these super old questions unless you are hurting for additional material. For someone just getting started with the LSAT, I would probably suggest only using these questions if you expect to do all of prep tests 101 to 158 in the new format, and you also are looking for additional material. I certainly wouldn't want you doing fake LSAT questions or GMAT or GRE questions when, of course, you could be doing more LSAT questions instead. So for the average test taker who's studying on a 2 to 3 month timeline, which I honestly think isn't really enough time to achieve your fullest potential, I would say if you're studying over a longer time frame, like 5-6 months, maybe then and only then do you want to do these additional practice questions. If you're a gunner aiming for a 175 plus and you're allowing 6 months or more, then of course I would say go ahead, use these just to get warmed up, just to dip your toes in the LSAT waters and avoid spoiling full-length practice tests. Because LSAC, in releasing these super old questions, they're releasing them as individual sections of logical reasoning or reading comp. They are not releasing them as full practice tests because, of course, they were not full practice tests. Logic Games, of course, is missing because Logic Games is no longer on the test. As LSAC reconfigured and renumbered the practice tests from 1 to 94 into the new format without Logic Games and instead replacing it with a second scored logical reasoning section, they renumbered them as 101 to 158, starting with exam 19 and up, leaving out a few odd exams here and there. And they also provided new raw score conversion charts and tables for those new format exams. They are notably not doing this with these super old questions 1 to 18, 21, 23, and such, because they just want to let you save them for individual timed sections, which is how I might recommend using them. LSAC, of course, has also released drill sets inside LawHub if you want to do a smaller set of logical reasoning or reading comp questions. But if you are going beyond that and want to do a timed section, perhaps to work on your pacing, these questions, these newly released questions from 1 to 18 and such, might not be a bad place to start, of course, with the huge caveat that these questions are old and older questions are less relevant. As I mentioned earlier, there may be some extremely minor, subtle nuances in terms of the quality of the questions that you're looking at here. Not to say they're bad questions, not to say they're flawed, but you might find small issues with the precision of the wording here and there. So again, if you're on a limited time frame, you want to use the relatively newer questions from Prep Test 101 to 158 in the new format as your full-length practice tests inside your LawHub account. Now, if you're not sure how to pull all this together, how to craft your LSAT study plan, of course, creating a personalized study plan is just one way of many that I can support you at LSAT Unplugged. We create personalized day-by-day study plans for all of our students whenever you're taking the LSAT, whether it's in November, January, February, April, or beyond. Whether you're going to use these newly released questions or not, there are a variety of ways that we can help you. We also offer live online classes via Zoom, on-demand video courses, small group coaching, and one-on-one coaching. You can check out the links below to find out more and to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. Now, one last thing I'll say about these questions before I sign off. These questions are only available with a paid premium LawHub Advantage account. You're not going to be able to access them in the free version of LawHub. LawHub costs roughly $120 for a full year of access. However, if you have an LSAC fee waiver, if you can demonstrate sufficient financial need to LSAC, LSAC will give you a free Law Hub Advantage membership. All you've got to do is reach out to them, apply for that fee waiver, and you will get your free Law Hub access. At LSAT Unplugged, we also offer scholarships on our LSAC courses for anyone who has an LSAC fee waiver. All you've got to do is email us at help@lsatunplugged.com, and we'll be glad to help. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.